Hey, what's up? Matt here. We had ourselves a little game jam the other week, and I played a lot with cloth physics and cloth simulation, and I noticed that there's actually not a lot of information out there about Unreal Engine's new cloth painting tools as of, I think, engine version 4.16. So I just wanted to throw a little walkthrough out there of how the whole process works. I'll try to do it both for just a scene object like a flag and for a character, but there's a little bit of bugginess to the UI at the moment, so I just wanted to show you some kind of tricks, some tricks to it all. So first let's just do something simple. I'll whip up a flag really fast in Blender. Let me actually close this little prototype so I can show you from scratch. You don't have to use Blender, obviously, but there's the most kind of difficulty in Blender, so I thought I'd show it this way. The first thing is that when doing anything skeletal, and this is going to have to be imported as a skeletal mesh in order to do cloth simulation, you've got to make sure the scale is correct. You can't just scale it up or down by 100 times in Unreal and expect it to work, because the cloth simulation is going to rely on a physics asset, and that's going to need it to be scaled pretty much correctly. So I'm going to link a forum post on the Unreal Engine forum specifically about getting Blender to work for export of armatures. But for now, what I'm just going to do is go over into the scene settings here and change the units to metric, scale to 0.01, because the default FBX and what Unreal uses is centimeters. If you export Blender units, it's going to convert that to meters for the most part. Theoretically, if I go and I export FBX, I should just be able to hit this little button here, which says to scale all data to current Blender size to match the default FBX unit. I've been having trouble with this. I recommend you just follow this forum post if this doesn't work for you, because getting things from Blender to Unreal is a real hassle a lot of the time. So, but the other thing you're going to want to do is hit N and change the clipping, because it's going to clip away anything I build here. I'm going to change this from 1 meter to 100 meters. That should do it. And I'm going to hit Shift A to add just a plane, excuse me. This is going to be 2 meters by 2 meters by default. That's good. And I'm going to R to rotate Y for the Y-axis, 90 and inner, and then I'm going to move it, we'll say -1 meter, just so its origin is up at the top, because it's going to be a flag. It'll simulate downwards. The last thing I'm going to do is hit Tab to go to edit mode, and I'm going to add some vertices here. So Control E, and I'm just going to subdivide this 3 times. That ought to do it. A limit you should be aware of is that I believe you're allowed to have cloth simulate with other objects, but it has to have fewer than 36 vertices, I believe. I'll check that number when we get into the character cloth simulation, but it can simulate against a character's physics asset or other physics asset, but if you want it to simulate with other objects, you need to be very careful of the vertex count. Okay, so this ought to do. I'll just hit Tab, and I'm just going to export. Export as FBX. Selected objects, sure. I'll hit this button. We'll export tangent space just so it doesn't give me that warning. And I'll just call this like flag.fbx to my desktop. That ought to do it. Okay, so now in my project here, I will import from desktop flag. Make sure you check that this is a skeletal mesh. It doesn't need a skeleton. It's going to generate its own. There's no actual armature here. It's possible that if you had a flagpole or something that you might want to skeletally animate that, or use it to weight some of the flag vertices. We're not going to need to do that here. Most of these settings don't matter. I'm going to have it compute normals. It doesn't need to generate a physics asset or import animations or anything. Most of the default settings work. Okay, this is a glitchy import from earlier, so ignore that. But what we want is this flag, which at the moment is going to be oh, there we are. It's just got an invisible material on it. I'm going to set this to this material I made. Oh, come on. There we are. This is just the material for the cape. It's just two-sided, so we can see it a little better. So the important things to consider is that if you have a mesh where some of it is going to be simulated and some of it won't, the only thing you have to consider is that the simulated part has to be its own material slot when you export from Blender, so that I can go into section selection mode here, click on it, and get just that part. If I pull up the character, you notice that I can select the rest of the body, all these material slots, but the cape is its own slot, and the hood is its own slot. So it has to be its own mesh section that you want simulated. Okay. You may need to go up into, I believe, window. Somewhere up here is the clothing, and check this. And then you'll get access to this window, which I just docked over here. You can do whatever you want with it. So once you have your section selected, what you're going to do is right-click, and you're going to create clothing data from that section. If this was a character, you might specify the physics asset you're going to use. We'll do that later. Naming it flag clothing is fine. If you've got multiple simulated parts on the same mesh, you may want to give them some fancy names, but we'll just hit create. We're not done here yet, though. We need to right-click again and apply that data to this mesh section. Note that when you apply it, it gives you the option to remove it from the mesh. You may, for instance, want to use a lower resolution mesh for the simulation, but apply that simulation to a higher resolution mesh. So you can have it remove that mesh from the actual static mesh in order to use it for clothing simulation, but not rendering. Anyway, you should see it appear up here. If you don't, this is a bug that I've found, and it may just be my fault, but I've sometimes felt the need to hit import apex file and cancel, and then it figures out that there is actually clothing data here. Okay, so now if I were to hit activate cloth paint while selecting this section, we'll move into cloth paint mode. Not hard. Pink means that it's not going to move, and I can hit H to preview the cloth simulation, and amazingly none of it moves. So here's how the tools work. You can scroll all the way down here, choose which tool you're using. Brush is a pretty simple brush. You can see it there. You can use fill, which will just fill the whole area, or fill by a radius with some value. Gradient is interesting. You set a start and end value, and then you click to set start points. I might set them here, here, and here, and then you control click to set endpoints. And then when you hit enter, it will apply, like that. So you see pink is 0 simulation, and white, in this case, is 100. Now, what does 100 mean? That is not percentage simulated versus animation driven. That is a distance in centimeters that vertex is allowed to move. I spent a day and a half trying to get a cape to simulate, because if you're in brush mode, I think this is just kind of a UI quirk where the scale goes from 0 to 100. If you don't have it scaled correctly, normally you don't need it to move more than a meter away, right? But in our case, we had the mesh scaled up too large, and so it was clipping through because 100 was not enough leeway. So this can go as high as you want. Keep that in mind. It's a number in centimeters. In our case, 100 will do. You can paint whatever value you want. I might want to paint 50 or something. You see that's a little darker. I can move into the fill tool and paint full 100. All over the place at a certain threshold anyway. And then smooth will just do what it says. It smooths over a radius. So I'm going to paint the whole top pink. And I'm going to leave everything else at 100. And if I hit H, very little happens because the top is held in place. If I were to set some of these, then you can see that they do actually simulate. You paint those back. So, note that I'm hitting H to make it simulate. Also note that if I were to drag this into the world, you're not going to see a whole lot. And the only reason that is that I'm still in cloth paint mode. If you're in physics asset editing or animation or anything, you won't see the cloth unless you're not in cloth painting mode. So that's just an interesting quirk to be aware of. The other thing is that it doesn't seem to be moving very much, and if I hit play, there's still not a lot of movement. And the reason for that is that without some movement to drive it, there's no wind by default in the scene. You have to add a wind directional source. And if I say cranked the speed, strength, and I don't know, all this stuff, and I hit play, and then I hit F8 to step out, I'll hit F11 to full screen. You see now we've got some wind blowing our cloth. How nice. If I step out here and I select my little wind sock, I can actually rotate it to move things, to move all my cloth. So there you go. Simulated cloth in the world. It's not so hard. It used to be that you'd have to download NVIDIA's Apex software that was built for like Windows XP, and it would crash 3 times while you're trying to use it, and it was not great. So that is an easy way to get started if you just want it. If you just want the cloth simulation for a static object like a flag. Notice there's a lot of settings here. Most of these control kind of the feel of your cloth. You can look up some presets online for getting kind of a leather or a light flag or something like that, but there's vertical, horizontal, and bend, and each of those has its own setting for stiffness. It's got just a global multiplier for stiffness, and then stretch and compression limits for how far vertices are allowed to pull from each other. And then you've got damping, which is going to control things like if I play this character and I swing the camera around, it's not a local simulation, and so the cape is going to do all kinds of strange things. It'll just control how much inertia the cloth has, this dampening. In fact, there's literally a linear, angular, and centrifugal inertia scale down here too. And then you can also adjust the gravity scale, and then the limits of how far the tethers can separate, as well as, and this is an important number, collision thickness. This is going to come into play when we do character simulated cloth. So let's go ahead and get started there. First, I'll show you kind of, this character here is an example of kind of what not to do. Let me import it into Blender here. And just the way the skeletal scaling works, this is a horrible example that I encourage you to not use. Let me just pull it up here. Import. My goodness. Yeah, so you notice the scale is off, the armature is horrifyingly scaled just because of the import process. You're going to have a hard time getting things back into Blender from Unreal just because of how the FBX scaling works, but I'll go ahead and just hide this armature so we can stop looking at that. I may be wrong about this, but the example of the way I'd seen the old Apex cloth done was to model the simulated part out back. This is commonly done for bone chains like ponytails. In this case, you're not going to want to do this. Because the setting is how far the cloth is allowed to move, literally in centimeters, you're going to want to model it in place and then adjust it from there. The other thing is that you're going to want to do weight painting on the skeleton for the parts that you know for a fact aren't going to be fully simulated. So if I select the armature, Control Tab, I think, well, whatever, I need to show it. Move into pose mode and then select, oh, that's not what I wanted, weight paint. We're selected the wrong bone, but you're basically going to want to have, for example, with the hood, you want to weight paint basically all of that to the head, because you want backup for when it's not simulated. You could potentially just paint the attachment, this little neck point, and weight that to the head or the neck, and then just fully simulate the hood. But really, you don't actually need the cloth simulation except maybe for these little parts up front, right? So you're going to want to have the weight painting there so that it will animate correctly even when it's not simulated. Same with most of the cape, except when it gets down to here. So over the shoulders and up here, you're going to want to have that weight painting information so that if it's not fully simulated, it still knows where to go. Okay, so upon import, a couple things you may notice. One is that if I select this, I activate cloth paint, I hit H, it simulates fine, just as a cape there. I'll show you, well, I kind of expected to be able to paint it here, if I'm being, oh, I had to select it here. So we have a really, really simple, just fully locked part. The front has a little bit of weight to it, and then the rest of it is just fully simulated. One thing you'll want to do is to make sure you have the physics asset set up correctly. It's important to note that you can use a separate physics asset for regular character physics asset, which is what we have here, and for cloth, which is what we have here. And that's important because there are a couple of problems you may run into. One, if you notice that your cloth just isn't simulating against the physics asset, you may have the scaling of your armature incorrect. So you may need to look at that forum post to try to get, maybe on import, or maybe when you add the physics or the the cloth paint, that it'll tell you the scale of it. You want that as close to an actual numbers in centimeters for a character, maybe close to 200 as possible, just for the physics to go correctly. The other thing is that if you have too many collision capsules, you may notice that the cloth doesn't simulate against it, so you may need to remove some. Cloth doesn't need to simulate correctly against, every finger individually, and you also probably want to be much more exaggerated with your physics asset on the cloth than you are on the regular body, because the big problem you're going to have is mesh clipping through the cloth. One way to mitigate that is just to have large capsules. The capsules for the legs and for the arms and things are much larger than they need to be, just to avoid clipping, because you don't really notice it if the arm collision is a little too big, but you do notice it if your arm clips through the cloth. So you notice that this is simplified, the capsules are much bigger, you don't even really need this much depending on what you're doing. We had a run animation where her hand was clipping through the cloak, and so we had to add that capsule over there. Quick overview of Physics Asset Editor if you're not familiar. You've got all these capsules, you basically assign them to a bone, and it'll move with that bone. It'll auto-generate one. The thing is, it won't auto-generate constraints very well. Normally, if you moved your leg, if I can find a bone in here, I need to deactivate that. Never mind. Your leg has a certain range of motion. In this case, there are really no range of motion. If I hit simulate, she'll just kind of fall to the ground like rubber. We're not actually doing any any real simulation, any ragdoll or anything, but you do want to have constraints set up correctly. But for cloth, you can just kind of put the capsules in the right place on the right bones and everything works out. So, you assign your cloth physics asset to the same thing we did before, where we clicked this and we applied clothing data. You select the physics asset for cloth. You can move into cloth paint mode, and you can do the same thing. One setting you're going to have to tweak is going to be collision thickness. It's basically the simulated thickness of your cloth. If you find your character clipping through it, that's a parameter you might want to adjust. You may need to adjust your physics assets, and you may need to actually adjust your animations. We still have this problem in ours where, you see there, I have to disable cloth paint for it to show up, but if I sprint, well, excuse me, well, sometimes her back clips through it. Oh, my wind is too strong. It's pulling it, that's why. But if you notice clipping, that's something you may have to adjust. So it's really as simple as that. You just paint weights, keeping in mind that you're going to want to have the skeletal weight paints on things that are not going to be fully simulated. You're going to want to model things like a cape in place, and then adjust this. Oh, where am I? I need to be in cloth paint mode. Adjust this paint value as you see fit. I think in this case, it's mostly something like 2000, because this mesh is scaled up. You see this approximate size. This is about 20 times as big as it really should be. And that was our cheap little workaround. The UI is a little buggy. For example, there's like this 3 vector here, but it also gives me these parameters if I drop it down there. Sometimes when you create it, it doesn't actually add it up here. You need to go import another Apex file. Oh, and one other thing to add is that you can paint against a different mask. Currently I'm painting against max distance, which is currently 100 centimeters on my brush, but I can set it to backstop distance or backstop radius. I'm not going to go into those, but just know that they exist. I encourage you to go onto the Unreal documentation and look up. Their walkthrough of the cloth tools is actually pretty good. Last thing I'll show you is in my character blueprint. In my mesh, there's some information you can check out. Things like, for clothing, you can disable it entirely. You can collide with environment only if the cloth collision is 32 planes or less. Keep that in mind. You can have it collide with children. You can set this to simulate in local space, which actually just changes the inertia. So it may not do what you think it will do. And you also have control in animations themselves. If I go into character animations and I pull up any of them, say this radical roll, I can add a notify that resets cloth simulation. That's just going to teleport it back to its original position, so keep that in mind. Anyways, if I take my wind and I knock that out, and I stop weight painting, then yeah, you'll notice we get a pretty reasonable cape. It's not great or anything, and it clips through under some circumstances, but you can do a lot with it, and that's the basics of cloth simulation. Feel free to tune back in another time. In the coming days, I'll be walking through how I did grass here and how to do trees pretty effectively and all kinds of cool stuff. So thanks for taking the time to check this out.